Looking at reading, math, and science in Dubai, that typo there just said, should say low benchmark. The average achievement of Dubai in reading was above the Arab countries' average, as you just said. At the grade 4 level, we noticed that students' results in math and science were 468 and 461 respectively. But the interesting feature there is if you compare results between grade 4 and grade 8 students performed relatively better than grade 4 students. And that's actually not necessarily a trend that was observed in all countries that participated in TIMSS. So it's interesting to think about the situation in your school. Is it the case that your older students or students at higher grade levels are performing better than students at primary school? And why is that the case? Do you have different instruction methods that are at the grade 8 level compared to grade 4? Are you allocating different teachers or teachers from different backgrounds to grade 8 compared to those in grade 4? Those are the sort of things that you can start to think about when you see these results. Now this is the sort of Dubai pattern, and it's consistent across the Arab world too, in that in many Arab countries, students in grade 8 perform relatively better than grade 4. That's not necessarily an international result. And in math and science as well, both grade 4 and grade 8 students achieve higher than the Arab country average.
النقطتين مهمتين. اولا بصفه عامه في دبي انجاز الطلاب في الصف الثامن في المادتين العلوم والرياضيات اعلى من انجاز الطلاب في الصف الرابع، وده نمط مش سائد عاده في دول كثيره، فربما يجب ان نسال انفسنا السبب في هذا النمط. هل هو اختلاف جوده استراتيجيات التدريس المستخدمه في الصف، ام هي مجرد اختلاف المدرسين؟ هل هو بسبب اختلافات اساسيه في عناصر المنهاج الدراسي؟ النقطه الاخيره هي ان في الصفين الرابع والثامن مستوى اداء الطلاب في دبي بصفه عامه اعلى من مستوى اداء الطلاب في جميع الدول العربيه التي شاركت في هذا التقييم.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
I can ask. Yes. Can you know how many Arab countries there?
That's coming up in just a minute.
To compare where we are exactly.
Sure. That's something you can see. I would also point you to the KHDA report on TIMSS and PIRLS, which includes the results of not just all Arab countries, but all participants. And you get a comparison in each domain for each grade level.
السؤال كان عن عدد الدول العربية المشاركة، وهي هتيجي في شريحة قادمة. أيضا هناك التقرير العام الصادر من نهاية المعرفة عن نتائج دبي، وهو تقرير مفصل يشمل ايضا ليس فقط نتائج الدول العربيه لكن نتائج جميع الدول المشاركه في دراسه التقييم، وهو متاح على موقع الهيئه.
So just a point that I guess was also made at the end of the first session, in that we are seeing a bit of a shift in terms of the countries that achieve at high levels in both of these assessments, both TIMSS and PIRLS. For example, in TIMSS, the top 5 results in mathematics were East Asian countries. 3 of the 5 highest results in science were also East Asian countries. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of their achievement, in grade 4 and grade 8 maths, the average result in Singapore was above 600. And just going back to the benchmark that we had discussed earlier, 600 sits in the high benchmark. So the average student there is already achieving at the high benchmark. And we said high corresponds to approximately top 5% of students. And if you look at the difficulty level required there, that's truly something tremendous there that we can see. Putting aside, and again, sort of questioning the sort of teaching techniques or what goes on there, we're just trying to show you the extent of progress that can be achieved. And the figure 600 was considered, well, unattainable really for a long time. But now we see an entire country, on average, has achieved that result in mathematics at both grade levels.
بعض النقاط العريضة والعناوين العريضة لمستويات الإنجاز على مستوى العالم بصفة عامة، نشهد في الفترة الأخيرة في دورات التقييم الأخيرة تغير إلى حد ما في الدول اللي كانت بتأتي على رأس قائمة الدول مرتفعة التحصيل في العلوم وفي الرياضيات. لم تعد من الدول الغربية. في مثلا في الصف الرابع ال3 مراكز الأولى لدول كلها من شرق آسيا، أيضا في المراكز الخمسة الأولى لدول آسيوية في العلوم. بصفة عامة النمط ده متكرر في التقييمات العالمية كلها. وفي 2011 كانت سنغافورة اللي هي بتأتي في مقدمة الدول الآسيوية ذات التحصيل المرتفع. المتوسط العام، وده ربما يساعدنا ندرك حجم التقدم المطلوب واللي ممكن تحقيقه إذا توحدت الجهود. إن المتوسط العام في سنغافورة كان 600 نقطة. ده معناه إن الطالب المتوسط بصفة عامة معدل إنجازه يقترب من 600 نقطة، وده بيضعه في المستوى المتقدم وقريب جدا المستوى العالي وقريب جدا من المستوى المتقدم في الرياضيات في الصفين الرابع والثامن.
So in terms of what the picture looks like for the region, and going back to the gentleman's question around Arab countries, so these are the Arab countries that participated at the grade 4 level, and I'll show you in a moment the others that participated in grade 8. The expansion of TIMSS and PIRLS over the last few rounds has seen more and more Arab countries participate with each assessment cycle. You also had a situation where Kuwait and Morocco participated at different grade levels. I think we spoke about that at the earlier session. Some countries participated not at grade 4 and 8, but say 6 and 9 or 6 and 10, depending on where they saw their students to be, and that was the case for Kuwait and Morocco, for example. These results are the grade 4 results that we're looking at. So you notice that the Dubai results in mathematics, as we said, were the highest in the region, but the point of looking at this is to encourage you to move beyond just looking at your overall math result, and to think about how that breaks down to content and cognitive achievement. And what we see here, and certainly a pattern across the Arab world, is that at the grade 4 level, the highest achievement was in number. Okay, so students were most proficient in the number domain, but the lowest achievement in grade 4 was in geometric shapes and measures. Okay, and if I was to show you grade 8, you'd find a very similar picture. Okay, so with the added domains that we have in grade 8, the highest achievement is in algebra, which is interesting, and some have offered, whether perhaps there's sort of a cultural explanation around that area, or if why it is that the students outperform in this domain. But again, the lowest achievement on average across the Dubai. So it could be different for your school, it might be different for your curriculum, but across the Dubai, on average, the lowest achievement is in geometry at grade 8, followed very closely by data and chance. And if you look across this whole chart, that's the same picture, right? In each of the Arab countries that participated, lowest achievement was in data and chance or geometry, and they were often very close. Why is that the case? Again, are your teachers not comfortable with that domain? Is it something to do with how much time they allocate to it in the classroom? Is it to do with not being able to sort of relate to examples outside the classroom in those domains? Those are the types of questions that you can start to ask for your own school when you see your results and comparing those to the rest of Dubai.
دي أمثلة لبعض أنواع تحليل البيانات اللي نعتقد أنها ربما تكون مفيدة أكثر من مجرد مقارنة المستوى المتوسط العام للإنجاز الرقم الواحد. ربما لا يكون مفيد بشكل كافي. هنا مثلا ده تحليل لمستويات الإنجاز في الدول العربية بطريقة القياس تبعا للمحتوى المعرفي. العناصر الثلاثة اللي بيقيسها هنا هي مهارات الأولاد في الأعداد، الأشكال الهندسية والقياس، والتعامل مع البيانات، عرض البيانات، تحليل البيانات، قراءة البيانات. بصفة عامة النمط السائد هو إن في كل الدول العربية تقريبا، وده ينطبق على دبي، إن مهارات الطلبة في الأعداد هي أفضل المستويات، في حين إن إنجاز الطلبة في الأشكال الهندسية والقياس هي الأقل. في جريد 8 نفس النمط يتكرر أيضا في معظم الدول العربية، ويمكن مش كلها لكن في معظمها. في دبي نفس النمط متكرر، هو إن الهندسة بصفة عامة تليها التعامل مع البيانات، هي المهارات، هي نواحي المعارف الأدنى في مستويات التحصيل، وفي حين إن الأعداد بصفة عامة لازالت قوية، ولكن الجبر بقى هو أصبح رقم واحد في مستوى جودة الأداء. ده نوع التحليل اللي ممكن يثير بعض الاسئله عن المدارس والمهم انها تجيب عليها. هل هو مرتبط بجوده التدريس؟ هل هو باستراتيجيات التدريس المستخدمه ام نوعيه المدرس نفسه ام المحتوى المنهاجي الدراسي ام الوقت المخصص له؟ في عناصر كثيره اجابه الاسئله عنها بتساعد المدرسه على التقدم بالنهايه.
So we can do a similar type of analysis in science and break the results down by content domain. Now, you'll notice one difference between the math diagram and the science diagram is that the discrepancy, the differences between the content domains are not as large in science. So at the grade 4, and you'll see in a moment at the grade 8 level, differences in student achievement across the content domains are not as large. Now, if you're wondering about the sort of ideal situation or the optimum situation, you know, where should we aim to be, we find when we look at developed education systems or countries where achievement but also student attitudes and engagement are high, their differences are quite minimal across these domains. So a sort of effective or ideal situation to get to is where student achievement across content and cognitive domains is roughly equivalent. Okay, so there are no major differences. Now, the one point that does jump out at us in the grade 4 level, again, not as strong as mathematics, but we do see relative underperformance in life science. And again, bear in mind that this is an average for all of Dubai. So it could be the case that certain schools do this much, much better than others, whereas in other schools, sort of life science is relatively weaker, and so the average works out to be roughly the same. But just so you know, at the grade 8 level, there's really no significant difference. And that's also, interestingly, a point for most Arab countries. There's not a significant difference between achievement in biology, chemistry, physics, or life science in general. Is that the case for your students? How would you find just at the grade 8 level out of interest? Yes? No? Is their achievement across the different content domains roughly similar? Do you find that they prefer?
For grade 4, sir, we find life science lower.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever you said is.
Which was the case for all of the
Yes,
bond. What about grade 8?
analysis.
And grade 8?
No, I don't have grade 8.
You don't have grade 8.
Yeah, in grade 8, for example, my school, they prefer, for example, physics more than bio.
Okay. So you notice that they have higher interest in that. Does that match achievement? Do you see that their achievement is higher in physics than it is in?
Still, we have to work on it.
Okay. Right. Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what TIMSS says about these.
Well, the idea is what TIMSS says, it's totally different from what Iowa exam says.
Right.
And for example, we did for 2 international exams like TIMSS and Iowa. In Iowa, we are above the international standard. But in TIMSS, same as what you are telling us now. Really, sometimes we are confused. We need to follow what? Which standard? We are doing the common core standard. And now it's the latest one in the States. And then if I check the TIMSS standard, do you want me to teach for the test? No, I will not agree for it. We got skills. But if I need the KHDA, you are an outstanding school, it means I have to go for these skills. And I have to teach my student the way that to increase their result. It means I have to change some of my standard according to the TIMSS standard.
I probably would sort of say that that's not something that anyone would recommend, and I'd probably allow the KHDA team to respond, but I certainly think no one is probably going to hold you accountable to a TIMSS result. What you might be asked about is what you did with that result, how you used that result, how that maybe informed either your planning or whether it meant anything in your discussions. Maybe, as you said, we explored
but they
the
ask
result.
about the result, and then the KHDA, they ask about the result. How can I rate you as an outstanding and your result is less than the 500?
Well, first of all, we just shared the TIMSS reports with you guys, so even inspectors don't have the reports yet.
I have it with me. It's signed by the KHDA.
And how many students participated in TIMSS in your school?
Just
probably one class or 2 classes. Nobody's gonna
45.
Nobody's gonna hold you accountable for the performance of 50 students when you have maybe thousands or 700 students. As I explained at the beginning, the purpose of sharing these reports for you is to give you extra information to help you in your self-evaluation as a school. It will, for instance, the example Mike was using, geometry, for instance. that most of the Arab countries performed below the average in geometry. But actually, in my school, it might not be geometry. There might be having a serious problem in another content area, in science or math or reading. So the purpose for sharing this report for you is to tell you have problems here, but your students are doing wonderfully here. Then what can you do with this data? Then you need to investigate, as the examples that Mike shared in his keynote, have a research group, try to investigate what is really happening, how come this is affecting them, but this is not affecting them, and what can you do? Inspectors are going to ask you, what did you do with this report? But nobody is going to hold you accountable and, for instance, check the judgment and science attainment based on the performance of two classes.
But what I think he needs to say is, see, even I'm doing the Iowa and doing the Acer, we have this also, but the results are contradicting each other. We are also following the Common Core standard. So, I mean, we are wondering what to do. Which one do we follow? We need to, I mean, focus on one certain thing. So, as we are in American curriculum school, I think we focus on the Iowa. That's more, aligned to our curriculum and our standards.
I mean, what we'll show you today, and we hope that you look at the benchmarks under TIMSS, and you'll find that there might be differences in wording or slight differences in the cutoff that they determine to be high or advanced. But generally, they shouldn't be opposing. Okay, so in most cases, when you look at the benchmarks, not the test score. So as you said, you might be below the 500 in one assessment, but that average, that 500, is a high bar to begin with. So what we're encouraging you to look past is that figure, that number, and think about what it represents. That distribution across the benchmarks should be consistent in most assessments. So we'll show you what TIMSS assesses, and then based on that, you can sort of make the judgment of, yeah, we know from another test, like the Iowa test, that this is also the case, or that this was an area that we didn't know was actually an issue for us because the Iowa test doesn't cover it. It's trying to, as Rama pointed out earlier, trying to see what it is about TIMSS that you can learn for your own instruction. So there would be areas here, this isn't sort of a silver bullet, you wouldn't sort of stop with TIMSS and say, drop all other types of assessment, internal or external, but it's an additional format, and it's internationally referenced. So there are very few tests that you can compare within Dubai to all other schools. There's no one single test that applies to all other schools. But at the same time, take that test and compare it globally. So that's sort of the advantage of TIMSS, with all the disadvantage associated with, yes, we might have a different focus, but there are sort of pros and cons to each of these assessments.
One more thing, Mike, is also we expect the school to meet their curriculum standard, but at the same time to aspire to achieve above international standard. And your example, you come from an American school, go and check our report and check the average score of students from United States. They come from American school, they scored above 500. Then that means all American schools in Dubai can also achieve above 500. So even for check the UK score average and all these home curricula that we have examples from. So we expect you to, yes, you have to follow your curriculum expectations and do what is required from you in terms of that curricula, but at the same time, I think everybody here, nobody here, everybody here aspire for the students to achieve above international scores, and really for them to be provided with learning opportunities similar to students in high achieving countries.
Just a few words from an inspector's point of view. Very often the differences in achievement can be explained by the different samples. In most schools, to the best of my knowledge, the number of students, how the sampling works here is designed to represent Dubai, but it was not, did not always ensure that it represent the total cohort of students in your school. And we trust that the schools will take these results and deal with them smartly and understand that the findings or the rating, the scores will apply to that cohort that sat for the exam. And if you're thinking about the inspections and how they deal with these scores, by the time we get this, the results will be in our hands 3 years after you sat for the exam. And I'm sure you will agree it would be ridiculous to hold you accountable for results that are 3 years old, because there are, with the demographic changes in Dubai, the cohort of your students will have changed 3 years from now, and I'm sure it is now different from 3 years ago. But it's a useful indicator for you to reflect on the quality of the curriculum that you provide, of instructions in the context in which those students that sat for that assessment at that point of time when the exam took place. And a third and final point, just to remind you, the framework of inspection when evaluations are made on attainment does not look at international assessment only. It looks at it where it can represent the total cohort of the student population at the time of the inspection. It also looks at students' performance in the lessons observed by inspectors. And it also looks at the internal assessments, taking into account the quality and the validity of this assessment. Can I?
Oh, yes.
Sorry. نقطة بس للتوضيح. أولا كنا بنتكلم على الصف الثامن وكنا بنقول إن مقارنة بالصف الرابع وإن كان هناك بعض الاختلافات إلا إن مساحة الاختلافات ما بين مستوى أداء الطلاب في الفروع المعرفية الأربعة في العلوم الاختلافات قليلة. في اختلاف ما بينها في الصف الرابع فده يثير كثير من الأسئلة. النمط ده متكرر أيضا في بعض الدول العربية وإن لم يكن كلها، فأكيد في بعض الأشياء مختلفة في الصف الرابع لها علاقة بالمنهاج الدراسي أو بطريقة التدريس أو بنوعية المدرس نفسه أو الوقت المخصص ليها شيء ما يجب مراجعته في الصف الرابع وفي الصف الثامن للوصول لأفضل مستوى، وهو أن يكون مستوى أداء الطلاب متقارب إلى حد كبير في كل المهارات. كان في بعض الأسئلة هنا على الرقابة ومدى استخدامها، الرقابة المدرسية ومدى استفادتها أو عدم صلاحية استخدامها لبعض البيانات دي. الملخص اللي احنا ردينا عليه إن في بعض المدارس بتدخل في امتحانات دولية أخرى نتائجها بتكون مختلفة عن النتائج اللي موجودة هنا، وردنا كان إن أولا جزء كبير من الاختلاف ده بيبقى سببه اختلاف الشريحة اللي تم اختيارها أو اختلاف الصف الدراسي اللي دخل فيه الطلاب، أيضا بيبقى اختلاف الوقت اللي تم فيه إجراء اختبار وتم فيه إجراء الاختبار الثاني. ده إلى جانب إن لما بيجي موعد الانسبكشن أو موعد التفتيش بيكون النتائج دي بقى لها فترة زمنية طويلة، وبما إنها لم تكن لكل الطلاب وبقى لها أكثر من 3 سنين بيبقى من الصعب تطبيقها على منطقة المدرسة كلها دون أخذها في السياق اللي كانت فيه. هي مؤشر ولكنها مؤشر مباشر. المؤشرات الرئيسية ما ننساش في جهاز الرقابة هي المشاهدات الصفية لعدد كبير من الحصص، الامتحانات اللي تاخدها المدرسة مع النظر في جودتها ومدى صلاحيتها، أيضا التقييمات مدى تأكدنا إنها تمثل فعلا كامل الشريحة اللي موجودة في المدرسة.
So one other type of analysis that you can undertake, and we're just showing you the grade 8 diagram here because it largely resembles other grade levels, but you find scientific reasoning to be the weakest cognitive domain. And that's something that, as you said, is probably not very surprising in that students are most proficient in knowing, followed by applying, followed by reasoning. Okay, and that's something that you find in most developing countries as well. Is something that, you know, in most developing education systems at least, we notice that there's a direct focus on knowing. We're showing grade 8 here because if you remember the distribution or the weighting across these cognitive domains, at the grade 8 level, the IEA expects a lower focus on knowing. Okay, they expect a shift towards reasoning, whereas we see very clearly here that in reasoning, on average, results in Dubai are lower than they are in knowing or applying.
ده مثال توضيحي من الصف الثامن في العلوم، لكن القياس هنا بيتم تبعا للعناصر المهارية والإدراكية، الجانب المعرفي، التطبيق والتفكير والربط والتحليل. بصفة عامة واضح ان في دبي وده نفس النمط المتكرر في باقي الدول، هو ان مستوى الانجاز اعلى في اعلى صوره في الجانب المعرفي بتحصيل المعلومات، لكن في جوانب التطبيق والتفكير كانت منخفضه بصوره ملحوظه، وده نمط متكرر في الدول ذات نظم التعليم التي لا تزال في طور النمو. من الضروري ايضا ان نتذكر ان عندما عرضنا العناصر اللي كان فيها الوزن النسبي لكل من هذه المحاور الرئيسيه الجانب المهاره، ان الجانب النوينج المعرفه بصفه عامه في الصف الثامن المفروض ان هو مساحته قليله، ده معناه ان انجاز الطلاب مرتفع في العنصر الاقل اهميه في الصف الثامن ومنخفض في العناصر اللي وزنها النسبي اكبر.
So the theme that we've been commonly talking about today are benchmarks and the distribution of students across benchmarks. Now, you notice that there's obviously a range of students across all these levels. There's probably no country in the world that has one or just two colors on this diagram. There's going to be a distribution of outcomes in every country. Okay, there are going to be students that sit along that continuum, along that range of below, low to advanced in all countries. So what we see here is that about a quarter to 28% of students at the grade 4 level would be considered below low. And remember, we sort of term these as students who are probably at risk, as students with a critical need for further support. But at the same time, you notice 5 to 6% of students are advanced. And if we were to add the high level to that, it would be 20 to 30% of students who are at the high level or above. Which is quite a substantial proportion when you think about how that compares to international levels. Now, when you look at your school report, you'll probably see a distribution that resembles this. And in terms of trying to link to other assessments or trying to inform teaching practice, this is probably the most useful, because you can try to understand what TIMSS is saying, at least, about the spread of skills and knowledge amongst your students. Each of these levels, we said, maps to certain skills that we'll talk about. But what we can see here is that there continues to be about a quarter of students below low. Now, we mentioned that the grade 8 results were relatively higher. Or on average, students in Dubai at grade 8 scored higher results than students in grade 4. And we see that in the distribution too. So if you look at the distribution for grade 8, it looks more favorable. Now, what do we mean by that? There is a lower proportion of students at this end. There's a higher proportion of students at the higher end. That's the type of distribution that most systems aim for. Okay, they aim to shift as many students from that critically low level into the intermediate, high, or advanced levels. So you look at advanced systems, for example, like Korea, where not only are their averages high, but there's almost no students in the below low. Okay, so that's something that has sort of particular implications for the country, for your students' outcomes even after they finish school. If at this point, we're talking about grade 8, they're at a below low level in either math or science, that has implications for their future prospects. So think about this distribution, think about how this relates to other assessment findings that you might have, and just consider whether this is also the case for you, that in your school the grade 8 distribution is better than the grade 4 distribution, and if it isn't, why that might be the case.
ده نوع ايضا من التحليل العناصر المهمه هتكون متاحه لكل مدرسه في التقرير الخاص بيها. التحليل الاول اللي هو كان بالعناصر المعرفيه، الثاني الخاص بالعناصر المهاريه والادراكيه، الثالث بيوضح نسبه الطلاب في كل شريحه من شرائح مستويات الاداء. المستوى المنخفض اقل مستوى اللي هو ادنى من ادنى مستوى التحصيل هو الازرق، والاعلى بالناحيه الثانيه اللي هو المستوى المتقدم. ده الاجمالي بتاع دبي، توزيع الطلاب في الصف الرابع في المواد الثلاثه 28%، 25 دول الطلاب اللي نعتقد ان هم يقعوا في الشريحه الحرجه اللي بحاجه لتدخل سريع. السؤال هو كل مدرسه المفروض تسال نفسها هل شريحه الطلاب عندي اللي في نفس المنطقه هل نسبتهم اعلى ام اقل؟ وبالمثل في نسبه الطلاب اللي في الشرائح مستوى متقدم هل نسبتهم ايضا في حدود 5 6% ولا لا؟ جريد 8 في الصف الثامن مش زي ما قلنا بالظبط في المستوى الاداء العام اجمالي التحصيل كان الاداء في الصف الثامن اعلى، ايضا في نسب التوزيع على الشرائح المختلفه هنا الصوره افضل بشكل كبير. طلاب في الشرائح الدنيا عددهم اقل، نسبتهم اقل، وارتفعت الى حد ما نسب الطلاب في اعلى مستويين المتقدم والمستوى العالي. السؤال هو المدارس المفروض تسال نفسها هل انا عندي ايضا الصف الثامن اعلى ولا لا؟ هل توزيع الطلاب عندي متشابه مع الدول، مع اجمالي دبي مع الدول الافضل اداء، ولا عندي شرائح معينه من الطلاب في الشريحه الدنيا لازم ان انا اقللها شويه؟
So we want to end this session by showing you some examples of real test items or real question items from the TIMSS 2011 round. And the point of showing you these is not to sort of say that this is something that you should sort of coach students to answer or teach to the test in any way, but it's just to demonstrate the type of questions that are in these international assessments, the kind of varying levels of reading perhaps that are required, the different complexities that go into the design of each question. But what I would like us to discuss, and perhaps just in the interest of time and getting everyone back to the auditorium in time, we'll do this interactively. Let's think about the difficulty of each question for your students. Okay, and there's probably no sort of one answer. Think about your students and the questions that we're going to show you. In terms of not just the content, because obviously in these types of assessments, and one would think in real life in general, we're not just interested in students' content knowledge. But you'll find here that there are various questions of varying length, language requirements in each question that differ. There's a different structure to each of the questions, and all of those combined would contribute to the difficulty level, or would contribute to students' chances of answering that question correctly. Now, some might say that this is not valid or not fair. You're not just asking about the content, but then again, sort of in real life, it's very rare that you get just a strict content question in any knowledge area that you approach, and a lot of it's going to come under different layers or within different structures that we would hope that students can at least see through and be able to understand what it is that we're after.
هنعرض على حضراتكم ان شاء الله بعض نماذج من الاسئله اللي بتطرح على الطلاب داخل هذه التقييمات. الغرض منها هو ان احنا نتعرف على نوعيه ومستويات الصعوبه المتدرجه والمختلفه داخل الامتحان، علشان ناخد الخطوات المناسبه في المنهاج وفي طرق التدريس للتعامل مع هذه التحديات. اللي هنعمله دلوقتي هنقدم نشاط او اثنين. بنطلب من حضراتكم انكم تفكروا في مستوى الصعوبه اللي موجود في السؤال، ومستوى الصعوبه الموجود في السؤال ليس فقط متعلق بالمحتوى المعرفي، ايه المعلومه اللي بيسال عنها السؤال، ولكن شكل السؤال، طريقه العرض، راس السؤال فين، الاجابه مطلوبه على اي صوره، اللغه المستخدمه بيها السؤال، المستخدم صياغه راس السؤال والسؤال بيها، عناصر كثيره بتشكل الصعوبه. عينه ونماذج اكثر هتبقى متاحه ليكم ان شاء الله في الفتره القادمه عشان تساعدكم تخططوا للتطوير.
So we'll look at a grade 4 science question. This was in TIMSS 2011. And the question shows a diagram or a pictorial representation of 4 animals, and it asks students to match the name of the animal to the ecosystem. And this is a grade 4 science question, bearing in mind that if your students study science in English, then that was put to them in English, and if they studied in Arabic, it was in that language. So thinking about the difficulty level of that for a moment, for your school, how would students view this question?
ده نموذج لأحد أسئلة العلوم في الصف الرابع من تيمز 2011. السؤال للمدارس اللي بتقدم منهج وزارة التربية والتعليم باللغة العربية بتقدم باللغة العربية بنفس الشكل، بنفس الرسوم التوضيحية اللي فوق، بنفس رأس السؤال ونفس الجدول، البيئة، ويحط الحيوان المناسب أمام البيئة اللي بيعيش فيها. مستوى الصعوبة هنا مختلف عن مستويات أسئلة أخرى.
Now, how do you view this question for your students?
تقييمكم لمستوى الصعوبة.
Yeah, for my students, we would like to have the same question. I will let the kids just match, not to write the name, just only match between.
Right.
It will be more clear for them.
Whereas writing the name might sort of give you difficulty. Okay. And how would they consider this question?
No, it's easy one.
Easy. Easy. Is that the case for most? And that was true in the data. When we looked at the data for Dubai, around 78% of students answered this question correctly. So that would place it on the easy side of the spectrum of questions in grade 4. Now, when we look at sort of other types of questions at the grade 4 level, this is another question in grade 4 science.
أيضا سؤال آخر للصف الرابع أيضا في العلوم نفس دورة تقييم تيمز 2011 لنفس الصف، نفس أيضا يقدم باللغة العربية بنفس الشكل.
So think about the difficulty level for a moment for your students. Now, there are 3 parts to this question, so you might have different answer for each part. But would you consider this to be an easy, medium difficulty, or difficult question for your students, sir?
for students here in this?
Yeah, your students or
For this region, I'd say this is very texty. Part of the multiple intelligence in the visual, Arab students in the visual, this is very difficult.
Okay.
For the Japanese or the Korean or Singaporean, this is an easy one because they're born to read. They go line by line.
Other comments? Yeah. For your school? Fairly easy. Okay. So you would think your students can get through this stuff? Okay. Might want to sort of have discussions with others. So, I mean, in terms of the data, it's certainly one of the questions that, as you raised, has an intense reading requirement. Even finding the question is a bit of a challenge in Part A, which students may have skipped it, just not noticing it. But there are also a lot of distractors in the question, and that's a skill that they're trying to assess. They're trying to see if you can read through the text, skim and scan, and identify what information you need and what else is sort of additional to the question. Part C was the most difficult question in TIMSS 2011 for grade 4 science in Dubai. Only 18% of students, so less than 2 in 10, got this correct throughout the UAE. So just thinking about, so these are the different models of questions. Again, in the interest of time, we won't sort of take you through all of them, but this presentation will go up on the WhatWorks website. So you can see an example of sort of easy, medium, difficult questions. And you'll see a difficult question might not be difficult for content, but it could be for language or structure reasons or vice versa.
طبعا مقارنة بالسؤال السابق، السؤال السابق كان مستوى سهولة، مستوى صعوبة، مستوى سهل، و80% من الطلاب تقريبا جاوبوه بصورة صحيحة في دبي. المستوى في السؤال ده أصعب طبعا بسبب طريقة العرض، العوامل المساعد، في عوامل تشتيت كثيرة، أيضا المستهدف واللغة الموجودة أصعب، العثور على السؤال والإجابة من داخل النص ليست سهلة. خاصة السؤال رقم سي تقريبا 18% فقط من الطلبة في دبي تمكنوا من الإجابة عنه بصورة صحيحة بسبب عوامل كثيرة. النوعية دي من الأسئلة لما تبقى متاحة على الموقع الإلكتروني هتساعد المدارس إنها تستوعب إن أحيانا بيبقى المهارة المستهدفة في بعض الأسئلة مش الصعوبة مش في المعرفة في المعلومة نفسها، لكن في المهارة المطلوبة لكي يصل إلى إجابة على السؤال. هيبقى في نماذج على الموقع الالكتروني متاحه للمدارس ان شاء الله تساعدهم في انهم ياخدوا فكره اكتر عن المهارات المطلوبه في هذه التقييمات الدوليه.
If you're looking for additional sources, we mentioned the KHDA report on TIMSS. Another one is the IEA website, the association that runs this type of assessment, and that's just iea.nl. The organization is based in the Netherlands. So if you go to www.iea.nl, you can look at the framework that went into the design of these assessments. You can look at question items or items in this assessment from 1995 to today. And you can also look at some of the questionnaires, even the background questionnaires that go into this assessment. I want to just end this session by looking at an example of a school report. And I'll just maybe allow Maggie to translate that.
بعض الأسئلة والنماذج الإضافية بتبقى هتكون متاحة على الموقع الخاص بالهيئة اللي بتشرف على الإكزام اللي هي IEA.nl.
Now, what we'll see in the school report is nothing that you haven't seen today. Your school reports, as we said, they're both feedback and support tools, will allow you to compare your results, firstly, in each of the different domains, reading, math, and science. If you had grade 4 students in your school, you'll see the results for both grade levels. You'll be able to look at content and cognitive domain results. You can compare within your school. So what are the sort of ways that you can compare within your school? Well, you can firstly look at the benchmark distribution. We said, looking at the range is very informative, but you can also compare male to female students. The section of your report, if provided that there was a sufficient sample, will allow you to compare Emirati students and non-Emirati students. This is the first type of assessment, certainly at the primary level, that schools can have one single tool that applied to every type of school, provided that their language of instruction was either English or Arabic. So you get a really useful tool that you can compare to any other school in Dubai, to the overall average, the curriculum average, but also any one of the 67 systems that you think match your students' performance. So just to give you an idea about the report, it allows you to compare to all participating schools, to schools that teach the same curriculum. You are also pointed towards the international benchmarks, so you're reminded about the thresholds for each of these. Now the comment in the box there tells you whether your result was significantly different, so whether you were significantly less or significantly higher than the result for that particular comparison group. Now, significantly doesn't mean by a large margin. Okay, it just means that it was statistically significant, that that number is meaningful, because sometimes these small differences don't really matter. So you'll be able to see the distribution of your students against the benchmarks. Again, we mentioned the comparison. Now, this is often very interesting, just looking at how females perform compared to males, whether that changes between grade 4 and grade 8, how that differs in particular subject areas. So all of these, as I'm sort of going through them, I'm thinking these are all different research topics. If you're going to set up these professional learning teams or areas of inquiry, or even want to do your own sort of individual independent line of inquiry, you can look at these themes. The themes that we found for your school, that were found for your school on average, whether they apply in the classes you're currently teaching, maybe keep that in mind for a whole of school type research project. And I just want to also remind you about the distribution of topics, so you're able to see within each content and cognitive domain what the focus is. And lastly, the point that I want to make, so this is again distribution within each content and cognitive domain across the benchmarks. The last point I just want to show you are these benchmarks, which we think are probably the most useful part of the report, in that you will see what proportion of your students are at each of these points. By reading these descriptors for the benchmarks, you're better able to understand what that means. How does that compare to other assessments? Okay, where, for example, you might have your own internal assessment and you set a pass at something that's equivalent to the low benchmark. So that's something that you can try to relate on your own, and rather than sort of sitting and waiting for the next round of TIMSS, you already have information in 2011 about what proportion of students are at this sort of distribution. Think about, the first thing to think about is, if this were to take place today, based on these descriptors, where would your students sit? And then by the time TIMSS 2015 comes around, where do we think our students are going to be? So those are just all the different ways in which you can use your report, and not just sort of view it as a way of either accountability or just trying to map against the international average, but to really make use of it to inform your teaching and learning.
Go back to the first page. ده نموذج من التقرير الخاص بكل مدرسة. في مقدمة الأول بيعرض العينة اللي دخلت والأغراض منه، وبعدين بيستعرض السكور والنتائج في كل مادة من المواد الأساسية، عفوا المناهج، العناصر الأساسية اللي هي كل مدارس دبي، المدارس اللي في نفس المنهاج، والصف الثالث في الجدول الأولاني بيكون الخاص بمدرستكم، وفي تعليق تحت منه بيبين إذا كان إحصائيا هل في فارق ما بين المتوسط العام والسكور الخاص بمدرستكم ولا لا. وبعدين في تفكير بالشرائح اللي كنا بنتكلم عليها، كل شريحة بتبدأ من نقطة كام؟ وبعدين في تحليل للبنش ماركس للشرائح عن نسبة الطلاب في كل شريحة من مستويات الأداء، معمولة بصورة إجمالية للعلوم مثلا بصفة عامة، وبعدين معمولة لكل فرع من فروع المعارف والنواحي المهارية والإدراكية. أيضا في تحليل لمستويات إنجاز الطلاب البنين والبنات إذا كان في الاثنين موجودين في المدرسة، وفيها بعض الاختلافات ربما تساعد المدرسة إنها تقوم ببعض الدراسات أيضا داخل المدرسة بصورة داخلية. ايضا هيكون في تحليل بالطريقتين ومذكورين هنا بالتفصيل تحت العنوان اللايف ساينس مثلا او الفيزيكال ساينس، العلوم البيئيه او الفيزيائيه او علم الارض. العناصر سواء بالمحتوى المعرفي او سواء بالمهارات الادراكيه كلها موجوده بالتفصيل في التقرير الخاص بكل كل عنصر زائد الوزن النسبي ليها. بعديها نيجي بالتفصيل البنش ماركس، الشرائح. واخيرا وصف تفصيلي لكل مستوى من المستويات، ايه المهارات والمعارف المطلوبه داخل كل منها في كل صف دراسي. يعني مثلا في الصف الرابع في الرياضيات علشان الاولاد، نسبه الاولاد الموجودين في المدرسه اللي موجودين في الانترميديت المستوى المتوسط، في وصف بيقوموا بعمليات كذا، بيقدروا يتعرفوا على كذا. في وصف تفصيلي للمستوى الاعلى لو حبيت ان هم يرتفعوا لمستوى اعلى.
Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, please talk to us now. Otherwise, thanks again.
Thank you.